and talk about the risk of exceeding extreme values. So my design problem actually becomes this. Again, now I want to define, like I want to design this for a 50-year return level. I have this formula. I only need to compute the P0 or for my initial exceedance, so I can design for that. In other words, if I design my seawall for this height, I know my return level will be, I can specify, I want to design that seawall for exceedance and once every 50 years, but under non-stationary condition. Okay, that's kind of the new concept that I'm talking about here. So that is the basic. Now the projections into the future could be tricky. You know, the extreme sea level, because of the uncertainty in mean sea level increase, because of the uncertainty in the ice sheet dynamics or ice sheet melting, we don't know which pathway we are going to be on. That's one problem. In the case of floods, we don't know it will continue to increase or at some point it will continue to increase and then flatten out. So that's when you find your planning friend and ask the planner, what do you think of the best the ice sheet modeler, and ask them, where do you think we will be heading, if they can answer that. But this is the case where you do some kind of scenario analysis. You know, what if you are on the high curve of the sea level rise or the low curve, and then look at what your risk of failure using different scenarios. I always think it has to be dependent on the type of project. Now, if you are on a coast trying to design a nuclear power plant or expand one like we are trying to do in Miami, you want to design for the high curve. If you're designing a small structure on the coast, probably the low curve would be good. So that's kind of the basic. So when you do that, so let me kind of get into more probabilistic modeling. So in this particular case, I'm assuming the extreme sea levels or extreme floods follow a generalized extreme value distribution. You know, you all probably are familiar with this type 1, type 2, type 3 Grumble, Frechet, and variable. So it has 3 parameters. So how do I account for non-stationarity in this probability distribution? Basically, that probability distribution itself is evolving with time. That's the question. So the way we model that is basically assume that those parameters are functions of time or some other covariate like teleconnection, El Nino, the AMO, whatever, right? So there are different ways of modeling that. If you assume your location parameter is increasing with time, you can assume linear variation and assume that your scale parameter and the shape parameter are not varying with time. So in this particular case, you are assuming there is the whole distribution is shifting upward. Your storminess may not be changing because you assume your scale parameter is fixed. Typically, the shape parameter defines the skewness, and that's a difficult one to estimate, so you don't try to work on that. Or in the case of some other, you know, if you're both sigma and mu are changing, you can assume an exponential model for sigma for good reasons. And then in the case of sea level rise, you know your curve may be quadratic into the future. You can build that into this location parameter as well. So there are various ways of modeling the probability distribution, how it changes with time into the future for future planning purposes. Then there is a question of model selection. There's something called deviance statistic, basically based on the log likelihood function. Let's say you have a quadratic model and a linear model, or assume no trend. How do we check the model, which model is better? So you basically compute the deviance statistics and use the chi-square distribution to know, okay, do I need to use a linear model or quadratic model or no trend at all? So it helps you to decide which model. And then there are other criteria like Akaike information criteria you could use, or Bayesian information criteria. So the point is there are various ways of testing the model, which quadratic or non-stationary model fits the best. And so I've done this calculation probably for one of the floods to kind of determine, do I need to get a straight GEV or straight GEV with time varying location parameter, time varying location and scale, and then you compare all these deviance statistics, archaic information criteria, or Bayesian information criteria to figure out which model is the best. In this particular case, a Gumbel model with changing mu and sigma are both the best model, for example. So there are various ways of testing it. So this is the final result, basically. So this is the thing that the people who do not understand the statistics, the engineers will understand. So this is what I call a return level curve. This is for the Swells Point tide gauge in Virginia. So you have a curve that says design return period and a return period under non-stationarity. So what it does is, like, if I design for a 50-year return period, let's say a seawall, it only has a 30-year level of protection because of the non-stationarity. Or if I do want to have a true, let's say 25-year, you really have to design for more like 40-year upfront. That's the way you interpret that curve. So you can, going forward, you can tell them this is what you can do, because it all depends on the, in this particular case, assume the medium curve. It could be scenario dependent. Or you can provide the risk curves to show that, you have a project life, a risk of failure. You can show that the dotted line is the stationary curve and the solid line is the non-stationary curve. And you can show them that, okay, this is how your risk increases because of non-stationarity. So that you have an assessment of that as well. So in that case, this is how the probabilities would change. And for example, in this, if you design originally for a 2-year return level, it will be exceeded almost every year after about 50 years because of non-stationarity. So that's the probability of exceedance. So that's kind of a nice way to, a new paradigm in terms of defining return level under non-stationarity. Then we have done additional work on doing uncertainty analysis using sort of the well-known delta method, or maybe a bootstrap method, or profile likelihood. I won't go into that too much. So that's kind of first part of my talk, return level and risk under non-stationary. So the next one I want to address is the nuisance flooding, and I want to show you an example of what it means. So this is actually a video I took 2 years ago in Miami Beach. So let me see if I can. So basically, this is Miami Beach, no rainfall, street flooding, miles and miles of streets, and a lot of rich people live in this area. And they have a lot of expensive cars. So salt water? That's salt water. That was the first thing I did. My car I washed once I got home right away. But people have to walk on steps to grocery store. Everybody has a pair of boots nowadays. So it's a hot topic. It's like in the coal mine in some ways. Miami Beach gets king tide flooding almost every year. So they're going to spend like $400 billion to put some pumps to pump out this water. And they put 2 pumps, and it seemed to work last year. I flew over that area. But so they're going to invest a lot of money. But they will have to increase the seawall height also, because there are a lot of private seawalls which are low. So it's kind of the weakest link in the chain. So that's we were thinking, okay, how do we formulate this in a mathematical sense? So here's kind of conceptually what happens, and this is what I think will happen more. You'll see more nuisance flooding, more frequent nuisance flooding early on because of sea level rise. Sometimes you'll get the big ones like Sandy, but it is the nuisance flooding. So in other words, frequency of nuisance flooding will increase. So how do I formulate that problem? So in other words, what's your risk tolerance? Are you willing to take 3 floods in 5 years, or maybe 10 events in 5 years? So that's a risk tolerance aspect, but at least, so formulate it. So it turns out that it again has a sort of what we call a Poisson binomial distribution. with changing probabilities, it turns out that there's a very nice closed form solution for the expected number of floods in a particular period. Because if floods are increasing, frequency is increasing, I want to know what is my expected number of events. Like here, if you have storm surge flooding, what would you tolerate? So if I know that, I can say, okay, I want to design so I can only have like 3 out of in 10 years or something. So that's the whole concept behind that. So then I created these curves, like you have a stationary curve. Typically number of events increase with time, even under stationary. You stay long enough, you have enough number of floods flooding you. So I can give you the increase because of non-stationarity from stationary. So like, for example, in the Sewell's Point case, this could be used. What is the risk tolerance, and then decide what level should you design for. And then similarly, percent time flooded could be another criteria that you could use. So that's kind of the second problem that we worked on, called nuisance flooding. And this book has not been published yet, but NOVA published a report last year on nuisance flooding all around the U.S. That they showed that the nuisance flooding has been increasing with time. They attributed that to the past sea level rise. So the last point is the regional frequency analysis. The whole idea is like, the reason I got into this was I don't know how I got into that, a committee on the Department of Defense. They want to know the sea level rise projections for all their military installations worldwide, but a lot of places don't have a tide gauge. So how do you do a frequency analysis to know storm surge in those, unless you use some numerical modeling on every place? So the idea was to do a regional analysis to see, can we kind of use regionally similar tide gauges, and I'll define that, and can you come up with a regional frequency curve that might be applicable, that could be modified for a particular location. That's the whole concept. So homogeneous regions, basically trading space for time. In other words, we don't have a tide gauge at this location. I guess there's a Coast Guard station here. I don't know if that, maybe there is a tide gauge there. But if you don't have a tide gauge, do you have, like within certain radius, that you have similar storm surge characteristics that you could use to define a regional frequency curve for extremes. And it turns out that this method of L moments is a very useful technique because it's good for small. If you're familiar with the estimation like maximum likelihood, method of moment, this is another way of doing it. So you have similar moments like the first moment, second moment, third moment, and so forth. And you can define what is known as a coefficient of variation, measure of skewness or kurtosis. So this approach is very useful for this regional analysis. So here's how it works. So basically, I apologize for this equation symbols. This is what happens when you go from one version of Microsoft to another. And you all are familiar with that problem, right? So this is Q sub I. So anywhere you have an arrow. Yeah, could be. So this is the regional curve, and then this is the some kind of index event. In other words, you scale your, let's say you have a location here, you have like 5 gauges around you, within certain distance, you kind of scale all that data. First you do the detiding. You have to remove the tides, and then you get the non-tidal residuals, and you kind of create some kind of index measure or event to kind of scale it, and then you pool all the data. So the idea is once you scale it for individual gauges, you can pool all the data and assume that, okay, these are all influenced by same storm mechanism and same type of thing. So then I would try to, again, mu sub I, some sort of physical setting, maybe bathymetry, are you in a hurricane influence area, what's the frequency of hurricane in that area. That's the idea. You kind of relate that scaling factor to some physical setting so you can predict it for ungauged location, because you will have these numbers for those locations. And then there are like homogeneity measures like H1, H2, H3. H1 is like a weighted standard deviation. So you can see if I pick 5 gauges based on the value of H1, I can say these are generally homogeneous. If H1 is too large, then really not homogeneous. So you have a measure of checking the homogeneity. So this is an example. Actually, I picked some example around here. So it turns out that they give you, they provide you with the curve, set of curves, the coefficient of variation and kurtosis. Basically, it gives you different curves, and you can pick the type of distribution that will fit your data. So that is one advantage. But once you fit the data, in this case, I found 3 sites close to each other. So I use 3 sites. Can I get a frequency curve that kind of uses all 3 gauges but scaled to that mean index event? So this is a regional curve that could be applicable regionally for places where there is no tide gauge. But you need to know that index event. So that's the idea that, because in the case of DOD, the military installation in places like Diogo Garcia, there's no tide gauge there, let's say. So that's kind of the idea, that you create an index curve. In this case, H1 is less than 1. That means it's homogeneous. And these are the mean annual maximum of the non-tidal residuals. You see how they change depending on the location. So you scale your data with that. So that method seemed to work. And we're thinking of using that. You identify spatially homogeneous regions, or use the nearest 5 gauges or 4 gauges, and then try to come up with regional curves for places where there is no tide gauge data. These are all non-tidal residuals, so you need to have a way to predict the tides. So final remarks based on this. The non-stationarity in extreme sea levels requires a new paradigm or floods, because the return period concept needs to change that we have defined. Turns out that time varying probability distribution approach could be used. The uncertainty quantification is also possible. For the case of regional frequency curve, you could use a Bayesian approach, and the regional frequency analysis shows some promise. So, and then I have a couple of papers. Here, one in Journal of Hydrologic Engineering, and another one on uncertainty, if you are more interested in that. And so with that picture, I'll tell everybody, don't ask me what happened to that cat, because I don't know. That's a common question I get every time. But anyway, so that's kind of what my talk is, and I think we got about 15 minutes, I think, for questions.
Or whatever,
yeah.
Until they turn the lights off, we're good.
Yeah. So.
This is not so much of a question, but in 1946, when I was in junior high school in Miami,
Okay.
we had an incredible flood. We had a very wet hurricane, and I'd say half of Miami.
Maybe 47.
1947.
Not 46, 47, right? I think it's 47. That's when the flood was happening.
This was. You got me there.
Could be, anyway.
46 or 47.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it was the first time. It was the first time the hurricane was seeded with silver iodide, but nobody knows that.
Ah.
And they stopped doing it. Well, anyhow, that caused Corps of Engineers to put in this extensive drainage system in the
Right.
Everglades,
Right.
which they're now removing because it's gotten too dry,
Okay.
which I think is kind of ironic. But that was freshwater flooding, and of course the Everglades always did have water there. And if you went out to where, this was before the Palmetto Expressway, that was the Everglades.
Yes.
And I was shooting ducks out there.
Yeah. Let me come to see. Maybe I can use this. Very first one, I showed you a map of Florida, I think, maybe. Let's see if I
But
can
it was
get.
not saltwater flooding. It was.
No, this, yeah, we can use this one. Okay, so these structures, I think you're for others who are not familiar with the other, what is the front side of Florida, as you said. This area, I mean, in 47 there was a big hurricane that the state was flooded probably months, and that's the genesis of this big flood control project that the federal government came in, and they built all these structures as a part of that. They also did, they had to put a levee here on the east side of the Everglades to protect these people from flooding. And then they also put some interior levees. Some parts they did that for drainage, but other parts like here they had to put levees because there was agriculture. So not just flood control, there were other purposes. So now the question is, now these don't function anymore because of the sea level rise. Not the way it was designed. I need to be careful what I say because I'm on being recorded, I guess. But this part now they're saying this levying off Everglades and draining it did a lot of ecological damages. So we are going to, the state is spending a lot of money on restoration, by the removing levees in the interior, but without affecting the flood control for the people. But we think that the Everglades restoration is one of the best, one of the adaptation strategies for sea level rise for two reasons. One is, in the southern Everglades, the more fresh water you send, hopefully you will build up the peat layer high enough to counter to a point until the tipping point happens. The other issue is that the more water you store here or flow here, the more seepage they're going to get for their well fields. So so we promote Everglades restoration as an adaptation strategy for sea level rise and climate. But yeah.
Back about that same time, 47 or so, they had to put a salinity dam on the Miami River out by the airport, way out there, because the seawater was intruding into the Miami Springs well field.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that situation is.
What that situation is, that is the place where that is right here. That place, that structure is one of those we cannot open twice a day. We put a pump station right next to it. That's called forward pumping. So we have two locations we have put pump stations, and that is one of the locations. That's a fair, if you look at, if you actually see the February issue of National Geographic, you'll see a picture of that. Yeah. So there's a lot of media interest, if you see the Rolling Stones magazine last year, I think. He said Miami, Goodbye Miami. That generated a lot of discussion locally, and we have a lot of media coming to ask us, are we doomed in here or not?
It's going to be a great artificial reef one day.
Ocean on both sides, according to Hal Wandless, but.
Has the occurrence of words such as global change or rising sea level decreased over the past few years in your agency?